For nearly 1,000 years, Rome did something that sounds completely ridiculous. It kept winning. Someone invaded Rome. Rome won. Someone rebelled. Rome won. Someone burned a Roman city. Rome showed up with an army and basically said, "That's cute. Now it's our city." The Romans conquered enormous parts of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They defeated armies that were bigger than theirs. They survived civil wars. They survived emperors who were absolutely terrible at their jobs. They even survived emperors who were technically qualified for the job only because their dad happened to be emperor. And yet, Rome eventually fell. So how do you defeat an empire that spent centuries becoming almost impossible to defeat? Well, you don't necessarily defeat it in one giant battle. You make it so expensive, complicated, and exhausted that eventually, the empire defeats itself. And that's the story of how Rome went from, "We own the Mediterranean," to, "Wait, whose army is that?" Let's start with the obvious. The Roman army was terrifying. But here's the thing. Rome didn't become powerful simply because its soldiers were stronger than everyone else's. The Romans were incredibly good at something much less exciting: organization, which is not particularly glamorous. Nobody makes a Hollywood movie called Spreadsheet of the Empire. But organization wins wars. The Roman army was divided into legions, each containing thousands of soldiers. They had ranks, training, engineers, scouts, medical personnel, supplies, roads, fortifications, and enough paperwork to make a modern government jealous. A Roman army didn't simply march somewhere and start hitting people with swords. They arrived, built a fortified camp, dug ditches, constructed walls, organized supplies, and then waited. Basically, Rome's military strategy was, "We'll beat you, but first we're going to build an entire infrastructure project." This was another enormous advantage. Imagine you defeat Rome in battle. Congratulations. You killed thousands of Roman soldiers. You celebrate. You drink. You tell everyone you're a genius. Then, Rome sends another army. And another. And another. And another. This happened because Rome had access to enormous populations and could mobilize large numbers of soldiers over time. The Romans were also extremely good at learning from disasters. Take the Second Punic War. Hannibal Barca famously crossed the Alps with elephants and absolutely terrorized Rome. Rome suffered catastrophic defeats. At Cannae in 216 BCE, tens of thousands of Romans were killed in a single battle. If you were watching this from the outside, you'd probably think, "Yep, Rome is finished." Rome's response: "Okay. Anyway." They raised more troops, changed their strategy, avoided giving Hannibal another easy opportunity, and eventually invaded Carthaginian territory. Hannibal had won some spectacular battles. Rome won the war. That's one of the most important things about Rome. It didn't need to win every battle. It needed to survive the battles it lost. Here's another Roman superpower. They stole good ideas. Not literally always, but philosophically. Absolutely. If Rome encountered an enemy with a better weapon, they could adopt it. Better military technique. Copy it. Better ship design. Borrow it. Better siege technology. Congratulations. Rome now owns a slightly improved version. The Romans were not obsessed with inventing everything themselves. They were obsessed with making useful things work, which is why their empire became this giant technological and military remix. They looked at the Mediterranean and basically said, "That's a good idea. We'll have that." And this is where things get really unfair. The Romans built roads. Lots of roads. Thousands of miles of them. Straight roads. Stone roads. Roads designed to move soldiers, supplies, and information across enormous distances. Because imagine you're a Roman general. There's a rebellion 300 miles away. You don't want to spend 6 months getting there. You want your army moving immediately. Roman roads made that possible. And roads weren't just military infrastructure. They connected markets, cities, farms, ports, and provinces. Trade increased. Communication improved. Taxes could be collected. Armies could move. And suddenly, the empire became much easier to control. Rome had effectively built an ancient version of. Have you tried turning the empire off and on again? They were willing to absorb people. This is incredibly important. When Rome conquered a region, it didn't necessarily say, "Everyone here is now Roman." Congratulations. The process was much more complicated. Over time, conquered peoples could gain Roman citizenship. Local elites could become part of the Roman political system. Local religions could continue. Local languages survived. And Roman culture mixed with existing cultures. Eventually, being Roman became less about where you were born and more about belonging to the Roman political system. By 212 CE, Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. That is an absolutely enormous change. The empire wasn't simply a city controlling everyone else. It had become a massive multicultural political system, and that made it surprisingly resilient. Here's where things get complicated. Because there wasn't one guy. There wasn't one battle. There wasn't one dramatic moment where a barbarian kicked down the door and yelled, "Surprise!" The decline of the Western Roman Empire took centuries, and Rome itself had already survived several enormous crises. The 3rd century was particularly chaotic. Emperors were being assassinated. Generals were declaring themselves emperor. Armies were fighting other Roman armies. Economic problems were getting worse. The empire even temporarily broke into competing political states. Imagine the Roman Empire, but with multiple people simultaneously claiming, "No, I'm the real emperor." It was basically the ancient world's most violent group chat. And here's the part that people often forget. Rome didn't just sit there and collapse. It fought back. Emperor Diocletian came to power in 284 CE, and he looked at the empire and apparently thought, "This is getting slightly out of hand." So he reorganized the government. He divided imperial authority, created the tetrarchy, reformed taxation, reorganized the military, strengthened administration, and tried to make the empire easier to manage. For a while, it worked. The empire stabilized. Then Constantine came along. He eventually became sole emperor. He founded Constantinople, and Christianity became increasingly central to imperial life. The Roman Empire was changing, but it wasn't dead. Far from it. Eventually, governing such a massive empire became increasingly difficult. So the Roman world increasingly operated with Eastern and Western courts. The Eastern half was richer. The West had fewer financial resources. The Eastern Mediterranean had major cities, trade networks, and wealthy provinces. The Western Empire faced increasing military pressure and political instability. And this created a problem. Imagine you're running a company. You have 2 branches. One branch is making enormous amounts of money. The other branch is constantly on fire. And you keep sending money from the successful branch to the burning one. Eventually someone asks, could we perhaps stop setting the building on fire? Unfortunately, Rome had no such meeting. Now we need to talk about the people traditionally blamed for Rome's fall, the barbarians. Except, barbarian was a Roman term for outsiders. It didn't mean these people were stupid. Many were organized. Many had sophisticated political systems. And many already had long relationships with Rome. Some fought Rome. Some traded with Rome. Some served in the Roman army. Some eventually became Roman allies. So the situation wasn't Romans versus completely random angry people. It was much messier. And then came one of the biggest shocks of late Roman history. The Huns moved westward. This helped push large groups of Goths and other peoples toward Roman territory. In 376 CE, large numbers of Goths crossed the Danube into Roman territory. The Romans struggled to manage them, and eventually, things went catastrophically wrong. In 378 CE, the Romans suffered one of their most humiliating defeats. The Battle of Adrianople. The Eastern Roman army was destroyed. Emperor Valens was killed, and suddenly everyone realized, oh, the Romans could lose. Not just against another superpower. Against groups Rome had previously considered manageable. This didn't destroy the empire, but it exposed something important. The Roman military machine wasn't invincible anymore. Then comes one of history's most famous moments. 410 CE, the Visigoths entered Rome, and they sacked it. Rome, the city that had conquered huge portions of the known world, the city that had terrified kings, the city that had survived Hannibal, was now being looted. People across the Roman world were horrified. It was psychologically devastating. But here's the important part. The empire did not immediately collapse. Rome survived. The Western Empire continued for decades, which is why the fall of Rome isn't really a single event. It's more like watching a massive old building develop structural problems, while everyone continues living inside it. Here's the less exciting, but extremely important part of the story. Money. Empires are expensive, very expensive. You need soldiers, and soldiers need food, weapons, clothing, horses, transport, fortifications, ships, administrators, and roads. Lots and lots of roads. The larger Rome became, the more expensive it became to defend. And when territories were lost, the empire lost tax revenue, which meant less money, which made it harder to maintain the army, which made it easier to lose more territory, which reduced tax revenue even further. Congratulations, you've unlocked the world's worst subscription service. Another problem was manpower. Rome increasingly relied on soldiers recruited from outside the traditional Roman heartlands. This wasn't automatically bad. Many barbarian soldiers served Rome extremely effectively. But the military became increasingly dependent on powerful generals and federate groups. Political loyalty became complicated. If your army is loyal primarily to its commander, and your commander wants to become emperor, well, you have discovered a problem. A very stabby problem. And now we reach the date everyone remembers. 476 CE. A Germanic military leader named Odoacer deposed the young Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus, and that is traditionally treated as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But even here, there's a plot twist. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for nearly another 1,000 years. Its people still called themselves Romans. Its emperors still ruled from Constantinople, and the empire survived until 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. So when someone says, the Roman Empire lasted until 476, you can politely say, well, about that. There wasn't one reason. That's the frustrating answer, and probably the correct one. Rome became vulnerable because several problems happened at the same time. Political instability, civil wars, economic difficulties, military pressures, increasing reliance on external forces, loss of territory, administrative problems, and enormous borders that were becoming harder and more expensive to defend. Rome didn't suddenly become stupid. Its enemies didn't suddenly become superheroes. The balance simply changed. Rome had spent centuries building an empire designed to expand. But eventually, expansion stopped, and maintaining the empire became the problem. And this might be the most interesting part. The same things that made Rome powerful eventually contributed to its weakness. A massive empire created enormous wealth, but it also created enormous borders. A huge army protected the borders, but the army was incredibly expensive. Roman citizenship helped integrate millions of people, but the empire became extraordinarily complex. Roads and infrastructure connected the empire, but maintaining them required enormous resources. Rome became so successful that eventually, success itself became expensive. So, why was Rome almost impossible to defeat? Because Rome didn't rely on one weapon. It had armies, money, roads, administration, engineering, population, political flexibility, and perhaps most importantly, time. Rome could lose a battle and keep going, lose a province and keep going, lose an emperor, and somehow get another one by Tuesday. But eventually, the empire reached a point where the cost of holding everything together became greater than the resources available to hold it together. And that's why Rome didn't really fall because someone was stronger. It fell because Rome became too big to be Rome. The empire that had spent centuries conquering the world eventually found itself trying to conquer its own problems. And there were simply too many of them. And if there's one lesson we can take from Rome, it's this. Never underestimate bureaucracy. It can build an empire. It can manage an empire. It can tax an empire. And apparently, it can also eventually bury an empire under several thousand years of paperwork. Rome may have fallen, but its roads, laws, language, architecture, and ideas survived, which is why, nearly 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it. And somewhere in Italy, there is probably still a Roman road that's in better condition than the road outside your house. So the next time someone tells you, Rome wasn't built in a day, Remember, it also wasn't destroyed in one. It took centuries and an absolutely spectacular amount of paperwork. If you enjoyed this journey through the rise and fall of Rome, subscribe for more history, with fewer emperors getting stabbed. Hopefully,